This moment I turned into my parents' neighborhood, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. Not because of traffic, not because I was tired from the 4-hour drive. It was that particular kind of tension that only this street, this block, this driveway could produce. The specific weight of a place that never quite felt like home. My mother had called 3 times that week, not to ask how I was doing, not to check in, just to remind me that Sunday dinner was mandatory, that my sister Danielle had something important to share, and that it would mean a lot if I showed up looking, in her words, put together for once. I parked at the curb. I sat there for a minute with the engine running, watching the lights glow through the living room curtains. I could already picture it. Danielle at the head of the table, metaphorically speaking. My mother refilling her wine glass first. My father nodding along to whatever Danielle said, the way he always did, the way he'd always done since we were girls. I turned off the engine and went inside. The house smelled like pot roast and something floral, a candle probably, one of the expensive ones Danielle always brought as a way of announcing her own taste. She was already there when I walked in, standing in the kitchen doorway with a glass of white wine, wearing a blazer like it was a board meeting, and not a Sunday dinner at our parents' house in Ohio. "Claire," she said, and the way she said my name had always carried a very specific frequency. Not warm, not cold, just faintly amused, the way you might greet someone who showed up to a black tie event in jeans. "Danielle," I said back. My mother came out of the kitchen wiping her hands on a dish towel, and she kissed my cheek and said it was good I made it, and then she went straight back to ask Danielle if she wanted more wine. My father was in the living room watching football. He waved at me without looking away from the screen. That's the architecture of my family, built over decades, load-bearing in all the wrong places. Danielle is 4 years older than me, 34 to my 30. She married a real estate developer named Greg, who wears polos tucked into chinos and talks about property values the way some people talk about religion. They have a house in a suburb of Columbus that Danielle describes as understated luxury, which means it has a waterfall feature in the foyer and heated bathroom floors. She works in pharmaceutical sales and is very good at it, which I genuinely respect, but Danielle has never quite managed to let success be its own reward. It always has to be announced, calibrated, held up against someone else's lack of it. That someone else, for as long as I can remember, has been me. I sat down at the dinner table and helped myself to the salad and listened while Danielle explained that she and Greg had just closed on a vacation property in Hilton Head. My mother made the sound she makes when she's genuinely impressed, a soft, extended "oh," and my father said that was really something, that Greg really knew how to build a portfolio. Danielle smiled in a way that suggested she'd been anticipating exactly this response and found it satisfying. Then she looked at me. "What about you, Claire? Still doing the consulting thing?" She said, "Consulting thing," the way you might say that phase you went through in college. "Yes," I said. "Still doing it, and that's going well? I mean, it pays the bills?" My mother's eyes slid toward me with a look I recognized, not protective, just watchful, waiting to see how I'd handle it. "It does," I said. "I asked because last time we talked you mentioned you were working from home and I just..." She paused, tilted her head. "I know that can be unpredictable. Freelance stuff. I just want to make sure you're okay. Financially, I mean." She said it gently. That was always the move. Dressed the knife in concern. "I'm okay financially," I said. "Because Greg's company is actually hiring coordinators, entry level. It's not glamorous, but it's stable, and I could put in a word." "Danielle," I said, "I'm fine." She lifted both hands in a small surrender gesture and smiled. "I'm just saying, some of us need stability and some of us are comfortable with uncertainty. There's no judgment." There was, of course, enormous judgment. I helped clear the salad plates and the conversation moved to other things. The Hilton Head property? My cousin's new baby, whether my parents should repaint the shutters green or stick with black. I was quiet in the way I'd learned to be quiet in this house, which was different from the quiet of someone with nothing to say. It was the quiet of someone who had learned that saying too much in this particular room cost more than it was worth. After dinner, Danielle made her announcement. She and Greg were pregnant, 8 weeks along. My mother burst into tears, happy ones, and my father stood up and hugged Danielle and then shook Greg's hand 3 times. There were a lot of me's, and this is so wonderfuls, and the wine came back out, and everyone was very warm and bright for about 20 minutes. And then, the way these things go, the warmth found its edges. We were all sitting in the living room, and Greg was talking about the nursery they were planning, and Danielle was saying she wanted to do it in the muted sage and warm white, very clean, very intentional, and my mother said it sounded absolutely beautiful. And then Danielle looked over at me with a particular expression, soft, practiced, perfectly constructed to seem offhand, and said, "You know what's funny? I used to worry that Claire would be ahead of me on all this stuff. She was always so ambitious when we were younger." A little laugh. Now here I am, house, career, baby on the way, vacation home. She gestured vaguely at me. And Claire's still figuring it out, freelancing from a 1-bedroom. No offense, obviously. The room didn't go cold so much as it went still. Greg looked at his phone. My father cleared his throat. My mother didn't say anything, which was its own kind of answer. I looked at Danielle for a moment. She was still smiling, still holding her wine glass, still performing the role of someone who had said something harmless and mildly funny. "No offense taken," I said, and I meant it, not because it didn't sting. It did, in the specific way that only things said by people who used to be your childhood bedroom neighbor can sting. But because I had been in this exact position before, had said the wrong thing or the right thing, and watched it make no difference at all. And I had learned, slowly and at some cost, that the thing I thought I needed from this room was not actually available here. What I needed, I had built myself. I just hadn't told any of them about it. Here's the part of the story that requires some backstory, so let me give it to you. 7 years ago, I graduated with a degree in software engineering from Ohio State and took a job at a mid-sized tech company in Columbus that paid me $62,000 a year and gave me a decent health plan and a cubicle near a window. Danielle had just gotten her first big sales promotion. My mother bought her flowers. When I told my parents about my job offer, my father said that was good, that was steady, that was smart not to be too risky. I stayed at that company for 2 years. I was good at my job. I was also, quietly, building something on the side, a piece of software I'd been sketching out since my senior year, a workflow automation tool aimed at small legal practices, which sounds deeply boring but turns out to be a space where the existing tools are expensive, clunky, and built by people who have never actually worked in a small law office. I spent evenings and weekends on it. I ate a lot of cereal for dinner. I broke up with someone who told me I was obsessed, and maybe he was right, but I kept going anyway. 18 months in, I had something that worked. I showed it to 3 small firms in Columbus. 2 of them became paying customers. Then I quit my job, which my mother cried about. Not the happy kind of crying, and my father asked if I was sure, twice, in the tone of someone who already knew the answer would disappoint him. And Danielle told me that I was being impulsive and that the startup world was a graveyard and that she just didn't want to see me struggle. That was 5 years ago. Last year, my company, Clearflow Legal, which I founded, which I own 58% of, processed contracts and workflow for over 4,000 law firms across 22 states. We have 41 employees. We closed a Series B funding round in the spring. And in September, 6 weeks before that Sunday dinner at my parents' house, I had signed a letter of intent to be acquired. I hadn't told my family, not strategically, at first. It just hadn't come up, and then the longer it didn't come up, the more complicated the telling seemed, and then somewhere along the way I realized I was curious, in a small and not entirely healthy way, to see how long the story they'd written about me would hold without any correction from me. The answer, it turned out, was quite a long time. Back to the living room. Back to Danielle's smile and my father's cleared throat and my mother's careful silence. I didn't say anything that night. I drove home. I thought about what Danielle had said and I tried to locate, honestly, what I actually felt about it. And what I found was less anger than a kind of tiredness, not exhaustion exactly, just the specific weight of having been looked at a certain way by the same eyes for 30 years. I thought about whether it mattered to me what they thought. I decided for the first time clearly that it did not. Not because I didn't love my family, I did, in the complicated way you love people who shaped you in ways both good and insufficient. But their opinion of my worth had simply become irrelevant. Not painfully, just factually. The way a map becomes irrelevant once you already know where you are. A week later, my mother called. She'd been talking to Danielle, she said, and Danielle was worried about me, and they both thought it might be good if I looked into some more stable work options. And did I know that Greg's company was still hiring, and she just wanted to make sure I was going to be okay, and she asked me, in a voice that tried hard to be gentle and landed somewhere in the neighborhood of anxious and disappointed, whether I was struggling. I told her I wasn't struggling, she said. Claire, you can be honest with me. I said, I am being honest with you? She paused. Then, Danielle says your apartment is very small. I thought about that for a second. Danielle had been to my apartment exactly once, 2 years ago, for approximately 45 minutes. It's comfortable, I said. I just want more for you, sweetheart. I know, I thought. That's always been the problem. The version of more you want from me has never once looked like the version of more I was already building. The acquisition closed on a Tuesday in November. It wasn't public yet. Those things take time, filings, press strategy, careful coordination, but it was done. The number on the wire transfer confirmation sat on my laptop screen, and I looked at it for a long time, not with disbelief. I'd been working toward it too deliberately for disbelief, but with something quieter, something that felt, if I'm being precise about it, like, finally. My attorney called to congratulate me. My co-founder sent a voice memo that was mostly him trying not to cry. A reporter from TechCrunch wanted a comment for a piece they were planning. I called no one in my family. My mother called me the next week. Thanksgiving was coming up. It was going to be a small gathering. Just the immediate family, Danielle and Greg, my parents' neighbors Jim and Carol, who had been coming for 15 years, and me. She hoped I could be there. She said Danielle was already planning the menu. I said I'd be there. When I pulled into the driveway on Thanksgiving, Danielle's car was already there. So was a new one I didn't recognize. Black, large, expensive, which turned out to be Greg's new SUV, which Danielle mentioned within approximately 4 minutes of my walking in the door. Dinner was fine. The food was good. My mother had made the sweet potato casserole that I've loved since I was 7, and my father was in a good mood because his team had won, and Jim and Carol were warm and funny and told a story about their cruise that made everyone laugh. For a while it was genuinely nice, and I let it be nice, and I was glad I came. Then the table talk turned, the way it does, and Danielle started talking about the Hilton Head house, and Greg started talking about a commercial property he was eyeing, and my mother asked me what I was up to these days, the way you ask someone about the weather, not expecting anything dramatic, just filling a moment, and I said, because it was true and because the time had come, and because I was, at last, simply tired of carrying a secret that was never really mine to keep hidden. Actually, there's been some news on my end. My company was acquired last month. Silence, not the polite kind. The sudden, structural kind. The kind that happens when something unexpected lands in the middle of a room and everyone is trying to figure out simultaneously what they just heard and what it means and what the correct reaction is. My mother said, "What?" "Clearflow Legal," I said. "The company I've been running. It was acquired by a firm called Vantage Group. It closed 3 weeks ago." Greg, to his credit, knew exactly what that meant. He looked up from his plate with an expression that was completely different from the polite, vaguely pitying attention he'd been paying me all evening. "Vantage acquired you?" he said. "Vantage Capital Partners?" "Yes," I said. He set down his fork. Danielle looked between us. "What is Vantage?" "Their strategic acquisitions group," Greg said, and his voice had shifted in a way I recognized. The voice of someone recalculating. "They don't acquire small companies. They acquire..." He paused. "What was the size of the deal, if you don't mind me asking?" I told him the number. The number sat in the middle of the Thanksgiving table, next to the sweet potato casserole and the cranberry sauce and the good china my mother only used twice a year, and it was very, very quiet. Danielle put her wine glass down. My mother looked at me the way she sometimes looked at things she didn't immediately recognize. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a recalibrating, like something familiar had turned out to be something else entirely. My father said, "Claire." Just my name. Nothing else. But in a voice I had never heard him use before. Not the half-distracted dad voice, not the gently disappointed one, not the one that said, "Your sister has some exciting news," something unguarded. Something maybe, like awe. "How long?" my mother said slowly. "Has this been? How long have you?" "5 years," I said. "I started it 5 years ago, after I left my job." "The one you cried about," I didn't say. "The one everyone told me was impulsive?" "The graveyard startup." Jim, from the end of the table, raised his glass and said, "Well, that deserves a toast." Carol said, "Oh my goodness, Claire." My mother stood up. I thought for a moment she might come around the table, but she stood there for a moment with her hand pressed to her mouth, and there were tears in her eyes, and I couldn't entirely read them, whether they were pride or something more complicated. Something that had to do with what she'd said on the phone, or what she'd failed to say at the dinner table weeks ago, or the gap between the story she'd been telling about me and the one I'd apparently been living. Danielle hadn't moved. I looked at her, not to gloat. I want to be honest about that, because I've thought about it since, and I think I can be honest about it now. I wasn't looking at her to win something. I wasn't cataloging the way her expression had changed, the flatness that had replaced the brightness. I was looking at her because she was my sister, and I was tired of the distance between us, and I had some small hope that this could be a bridge. "Why didn't you tell us?" she said. Her voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. "I tried to," I said, "in pieces. But there was always," I paused. "It was hard to find a way in." She looked at the table, then at me. "I told you to get a stable job. I sent you listings." I said the startup world was a... "I know," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then quietly, "I thought you were struggling." "I know," I said again. I genuinely thought I know Danielle. And then, because I meant it, "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad. I'm telling you because I wanted you to know. I wanted all of you to know. I wanted all of you to know. I just didn't know how to bring it into this room." She looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in her face. Not dramatically, not a movie moment. Just a small, private shift. The kind that's actually the harder kind. "That's fair," she said at last. Very quietly. "That's fair." My father came around the table and hugged me properly, both arms, the kind of hug he hadn't given me since I was maybe 12 years old, and he said he was proud of me, and I believed him and I held on to it. My mother kept saying she couldn't believe it, and then she said she could believe it. Actually, she always knew I had something in me, and I let that stand even though I had a very specific memory of the phone call where she asked me if I was struggling. And I let it stand because I'm 30 years old, and I've spent enough years hoping this family would be something it mostly wasn't, and I've decided to accept what it is while building something separate, something mine, something that doesn't need their belief in order to exist. Greg asked me several detailed questions about the acquisition, about the funding history, about whether I had a non-compete, and I answered them all without resentment because I actually didn't blame Greg. Had only ever seen what everyone in this room had seen, which was the version of me that this room had always produced. That version was not the whole version. It was never the whole version. After dinner, Danielle and I did the dishes together, the way we used to when we were kids, her washing, me drying, which was always the division. We didn't talk much, but at some point she handed me a plate and said, without looking at me, that thing I said at dinner last month about you still figuring it out. "Yeah," I said. "I'm sorry. It wasn't a big apology. It wasn't a reckoning. It was just 2 words, offered over soapy water in our mother's kitchen, and I took them for what they were." "Thank you," I said. She handed me another plate. I dried it and put it away. The window above the sink looked out onto the backyard, the same yard I'd grown up in, the same oak tree, same fence. Different version of everything happening inside. Here's what I've been sitting with since then. For a long time I wanted the people in that house to see me clearly, not to be impressed by me, though I'll admit that would have been nice, but just to see me. To know that the quiet one, the one who left her steady job, the one who wasn't building equity in real estate or moving up a corporate ladder in any visible way, was not lost, was not struggling, was not someone who needed a referral to an entry-level coordinator position. I wanted them to know that there is more than one way to build a life, and that the ones that don't look like much from the outside are not always small. Sometimes they are enormous. Sometimes the difference between what something looks like and what it actually is turns out to be, well, it turns out to be the whole story. I don't need my family to have believed in me from the beginning. I did this without their belief, and that means something, maybe the thing that matters most. You can love people and outgrow their limitations at the same time. You can want a real relationship with your sister and also know, clearly and without bitterness, that her assessment of your worth was never the accurate one. I'm not angry at Danielle. I'm not angry at my parents. I'm 30 years old, and I sold a company I built from nothing, and I drove home from Thanksgiving with sweet potato casserole and a Tupperware container on the passenger seat, and I thought, I'm okay. I have been okay for a long time. I just had to stop waiting for the people in that room to notice before I was allowed to feel it. You don't need the room to see you in order to be real. Build the thing. Do the work. Let them catch up when they're ready. And if they never do, you'll be fine. You already are. There's a version of this story where I walk into that Thanksgiving dinner and immediately set the record straight, where I say the number out loud the moment Danielle calls me a failure, where I watch her face change in real time and feel something sharp and satisfying about it. I understand why people want that version. I wanted it too, for a long time. But here's what I've come to believe, and I believe it not because someone told me to, but because I lived the alternative for years. The desire to prove yourself to the people who doubted you is one of the most expensive habits you can carry. It costs you sleep. It costs you focus. It costs you the clarity you need to actually build something real. I spent more energy than I should have imagining the moment my family would finally see me clearly. And every hour I spent on that fantasy was an hour I wasn't spending on the thing that would actually matter. What changed me wasn't success. It was the decision, made quietly and without fanfare, sometime in my second year of building Clearflow, to stop building it for them. To stop doing the work as a form of argument. To let the company become what it needed to become because it deserved to, because the problem it solved is real, because the people using it needed it, because I was genuinely good at this, and that goodness had nothing to do with whether my mother thought I was struggling or my sister thought I was lost. That shift, from building to prove to building because it matters, is the thing no one talks about when they tell entrepreneurship stories. Everyone focuses on the funding rounds and the acquisition numbers and the moment the room goes quiet, but the actual hinge point, the place where everything changed, was much smaller and much earlier. It was a Tuesday night when I was eating cereal for dinner and debugging the same function for the third time that week, and I realized I wasn't miserable. I was completely absorbed. And that absorption, not ambition, not spite, not the need to be seen, that was what was going to carry me all the way through. What you put into your work over years comes back to you in kind, not magically, not on any schedule you can predict, but consistently, if you stay honest about the quality of the effort, the corners you refuse to cut, the clients you actually listen to, the problems you stay with past the point of comfort. Those decisions compound. They compound the way Danielle's doubts compounded, just in the opposite direction. She had been collecting evidence for years that I was directionless. I had been, without fully realizing it, collecting something else entirely. I don't tell this story to embarrass my sister. I tell it because I think a lot of people are sitting in rooms right now where someone who loves them is also, in some fundamental way, not seeing them. And I want those people to hear this. The room's failure to see you is not evidence about you. It is evidence about the limits of what that room was built to recognize. Your job is not to convince the room. Your job is to keep building, keep going, keep showing up for the work with honesty and discipline and genuine care for what you're making. and to trust that a life constructed on those terms will eventually speak for itself. Claire's number spoke for itself on a Tuesday in November. Yours will speak in its own time. Do the work anyway.